So with the launch of every new Xenoblade game, there always seems to be something for the fans to argue over. In Xenoblade 3, it was whether the DLC should be a sequel or a prequel. In Xenoblade 2, and in Future Redeemed, it's whether the series is heading towards Xenosaga or Xenoblade X. Personally, I don't really mind either way, but I do think X has a better chance of being connected than Saga does, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll either feel the same or at least understand where I'm coming from. As always though, if you enjoy this type of content and want to see more of it on the channel, click that subscribe button and notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest Xenoblade news, theories and guides that I upload on the channel. Also, major spoiler warning for the end of Future Redeemed, Xenoblade X and Xenosaga, as we'll be discussing these topics throughout the duration of this video. With all that out of the way, let's get right into the Xenoblade X theory. When it comes to Xenoblade X, the main reasoning for people thinking that it's now connected to the numbered Xenoblade games is due to the name drop of the Earth-Life colonization project, Project Exodus. As many fans will know, however, these two events mentioned in either game do not seem to line up with one another. In Future Redeemed, this project seems to be about sending people into the stars peacefully to find a new habitable world to live on, assumed through the naming of Earth-Life colonization, whereas in Xenoblade X, the project was designed to flee from Earth when two alien forces did battle above the surface of the planet. Ultimately, both projects had the same goal in finding a new world for the people of Earth to live on, but the reasoning for each seems to be drastically different when it comes to either game. And due to this discretion and the circumstances of each, it's impossible that both can be the same event. This is why many people up until this point have disregarded X as being a possibility, as without fixing this issue, the two could never coincide with one another. But I have a solution to this conundrum, which I'll describe later in the theory portion of this video. In terms of other evidence, it was also mentioned that there was a coalition government within Klaus's world, the same also being mentioned in Xenoblade X's intro. Whilst this doesn't and won't outright prove anything, I feel it's necessary to point out all of the similarities the two games have. In that respect, it's also noteworthy to mention the reused models from Xenoblade X when constructing Klaus's world. I mean, they literally just copied and pasted some of the house models from X directly into this world and thought we wouldn't notice, and the ones that aren't the exact same are damn close, except for the scaling. Either people are taller in Klaus's world or the conduit makes people shrink. The point is that a number of assets from X were taken and integrated into this world, but at the end of the day, this proves nothing, as companies like this reuse assets all over the place to save time. What is more important in my book, however, is all of the pre-established lore X already has, which is something that I am somewhat of an expert on. For instance, the Orth, an alien race within X, live day to day abiding by the will of something within them known as the Over. The Over in one particular questline describes its old world as an endless ocean where Telethia thrived, which sounds slightly like the Xenoblade 1 universe. Here's another one for you though, which is surrounding the Aris Skell and the Ouroboros forms, something that I've talked about on the channel before Xenoblade 3 had even released. In Future Redeemed, the large 6-man Ouroboros model actually has these parts on its limbs highlighted in green, which all start with the name Ares in the files. The Aris Skell is unique within Xenoblade X, as whilst one was built by humans, the original design was alien, and yet underneath all of the armor, it looks identical to the Ouroboros forms in 3, as depicted from the Xenoblade X art book. The point is, there are already connections to the mainline games, whether they be references or not, and whilst I appreciate that the majority of you can't see how this connects to X, even after playing it, hopefully the theory I'm about to share, utilizing all of the knowledge and lore I'm familiar with on X, can convince you otherwise, or at least get you to believe that there is a slither of hope for X to be canon. As I stated before, the events surrounding Project Exodus cannot be the same events within both Xenoblade X and the Klaus Saga, and any theory I provide stating otherwise would be absolutely ludicrous. But what if there were two Project Exoduses? And not only that, but what if there were two Earths? Up until now, the topic of a second Earth has always been a major point of contention for me, as I've never really been able to explain how that might be possible. That was until Future Redeemed came out. From the radio scene, we learned that the people of Klaus's world had already mastered the art of space travel, hence them sending close to 3 million people out into the stars on nothing other than the Earth Life Colonization Project. With the assumption that the goal of this project was to find a new habitable planet to live on, likely due to overpopulation or some other futuristic first world problem, we can surmise that one of these ships that was sent into the cosmos managed to actually achieve their goal and found a new planet for them to call home. We can assume that this would be a barren, fresh world for humans to take refuge on, and over thousands of years, people would begin to rebuild their civilization from the ground up. It's possible that during this process, however, some things might have gone wrong. Perhaps they weren't prepared enough for the oncoming storm and couldn't sustain the lives of 500,000 people on this new world with no infrastructure. Perhaps there were new diseases and threats, unlike any found on their old world, or perhaps some crazy whack space-time anomaly event affected all of their plans. The point is that the people of this new world likely experienced some setbacks, which may have regressed or even delayed their development as an intelligent species, meaning that a few thousand years later, when they had virtually colonized the entire planet, they were no more technologically advanced than their ancestors who arrived on this new world. What's more, after naming this new planet Earth in homage to their old world, all of their history and experiences would begin to blur together into one, entirely erasing their old homeworld from the minds of the present day survivors. After a few thousand years, however, roughly around the year of 2026 AD, a mysterious unidentified flying object would enter Earth's atmosphere and make contact with its inhabitants. A girl with blue skin wearing a black skin-tight outfit would warn of an incoming battle between two alien races, which would ravage the planet and burn even the skies above. But to prevent their destruction, she would bestow gifts upon them, technology from another world, advancing them leaps and bounds into the future and allowing the coalition government to pull their knowledge together and through time give birth to a single point of hope: the Earth Life Colonization Project, Project Exodus. Through the combined effort of the entire planet, Earth would build colony ships and launch them from every major city around the globe, aiming to flee the planet and avoid their total oblivion. And after 20 or so years, the time was finally upon them. Two great alien forces, known as the Ghosts and the Ganglion, would wage war above the planet's surface and inevitably end up eradicating this new Earth. The White Whale would be among the ships to have fled the ensuing chaos, avoiding their devastation and becoming refugees throughout the stars, until sometime in the future, their past would eventually catch up with them, and once more, they'd be under attack by one of the alien forces, suffering damage in the conflict and becoming stranded on a nearby new planet named Mira. This whole scene of events would then be represented at the end of Future Redeemed, with the blue star falling towards the planet, the colour resembling the ship's engines. This planet, unlike any other they had seen before, would be inhabited by a wide variety of fauna and flora, as well as ruins from what appears to be an ancient civilization. Unbeknownst to them, however, this would in fact be their original homeworld, their Lost Jerusalem as it would be. This planet would be Ionios, and allow me to explain how this would be possible. With the end of Future Redeemed, we now know that both worlds of Kevis and Agnes have become one once more, and whilst there is now peace after the defeat of Mobius, there would still be one threat that loomed above them all: origin. Whilst it had achieved its initial purpose, the events of Xenoblade 3 should be more than enough to prove how dangerous a weapon Origin could be in the wrong hands, and thus, both nations decided to seal their creation at the core of their planet. Over thousands of years, however, things inevitably start to break down and go wrong, and who knows what sort of negative effect that could have on the ecosystem of their world, gradually, over time, transforming Ionios into the area we know as Mira. Subsequently, I believe that Mira is Ionios, and that over time, its landscapes have been transformed by a malfunctioning Origin, as that can easily explain all of the weirdness on this planet. For instance, Origin's primary purpose was to serve as a more advanced lifehold core, storing the very souls of people within itself, and so it stands to reason that after we discover that the core is destroyed from the impact with Mira, that the consciousnesses of all those within were transferred to Origin, allowing all those people to stay alive within their Mimia zones. In extension, Lao was also able to be brought back due to Origin rebuilding his body. We can assume that this was partially due to Lao coming into contact with actual pure human DNA, as many people die during the duration of Xenoblade X, and only Lao has been visibly seen coming back to life. The point is that through the duration of the game, many questions are brought up about Mira, and all of them can be resolved with Origin. The beautiful thing about this story, however, is that it would then proceed to go full circle and head back to Klaus's world. It's speculated that Mira was the original homeworld of the Samarians, an intergalactic federation spread out over 6 million light years of space. This race of people were dominant within the cosmos and seemed to flourish utilizing different forms of bioengineering, creating slave races for them to control, which is how the Ganglion were originally born, as well as the Zarubogan. In fact, whilst we know very little about the Samarians themselves, it's thanks to their creation that revealed that they resemble humans, which makes sense considering those from the New Earth were thought to be their descendants, and the only way for that to make sense would be if the Samarians themselves were the people of Klaus's world. We know that at least 8 ships left, and whilst one of those may have found a new planet to call home, it's extremely pessimistic to assume that they all would. This is why, based within this theory, the Samarians would in fact be the other people who left Klaus's world in search of a new home. But when they weren't quite as lucky, they instead turned to the stars themselves, creating an empire known as the Samarian Federation. Now, to prove this might be possible, I'd like to bring up the Saviorites who are mentioned in Xenoblade 2 and 3. In Japanese, the name Saviorites is actually translated to Salvator, who were a faction of people from Xenosaga. These people were experimented on, granting them unique powers like extended lifespans, but they were not treated as living human beings, which eventually caused an uprising. If we assume that there are similar circumstances surrounding the Saviorite rebels, supported by the mention of the Saviorite Human Rights Protection Bill, it's easy to believe that the people of Klaus's world would not be above manufacturing their own slaves. It's therefore not a stretch to believe that the others from Klaus's world may be the Samarians, and that they'd fabricate new slave races to do their bidding, unable to revolt against their masters due to failsafes programmed into them. For example, the Zarubogan were a race created to clean up after the Samarians by consuming what is in effect pollution, and therefore relying on them to keep producing more, else exhausting their food supply, whereas the Ganglion were likely made as warriors designed to conquer all other worlds, but the mere touch of human DNA would cause them to dissolve, preventing them from ever harming their creators. Speaking of which, the Ganglion also worship certain beings they refer to as the Great Ones, and these could easily be the original Saviorite rebels. In fact, it would only make sense as they pilot humanoid-style skulls based on the Vita and seem to have an ancient connection with the Samarians themselves, so personally, this doesn't seem like much of a stretch in logic. We can even likely assume that it was the Saviorite rebels who freed the Ganglion and other races from the Samarians' control, ultimately leading to them worshipping them as the Great Ones and fighting back against their rulers. Moreover, the plot thickens when you consider that Dmitry Yuriev could have been the one to instigate the original Saviorite rebels in the first place, making us wonder how deep this plotline really goes. Yuriev in Xenosaga had the tendency to transplant his consciousness into newer, younger vessels, which allowed him to extend his lifespan. Due to this, and done for long enough, it's possible that he implanted himself within the Saviorites, allowing him to continue to exist even from the Klaus World era, possibly due to core crystal shenanigans, which doesn't make it unfathomable for Dmitry to actually be the Great One Luxar is referring to, and potentially make him the major villain throughout this narrative. The rest of the Xenoblade X story would then proceed like normal, with our heroes fighting to re-secure the Lifehold and making friends with a whole lot of Xeno racers in the process. Largely though, that pretty much sums up all of the details surrounding this Xenoblade X theory, but I'm sure some of you still have your suspicions about the legitimacy of this idea and if it could actually work or not, so let's shave away some of those doubts. Other than the Project Exodus conundrum, the major issue I've seen people be concerned about in relation to this idea is the fact that this would require the coincidence of there being two Earths, with the exact same cities within each. I admit, the idea that the people from Klaus's world would just so happen to rebuild an exact replica of their old world is a bit far-fetched, so it's a good thing that they don't. Speculated with Xenoblade 2 and confirmed through Future Redeemed, Klaus's world was actually split into 13 different domains, which they called authorities. Each of these authorities were organized and run by their own independent government, with Dmitry Yuriev being a member of the Minos Authority, one of the other 3 beanstalks within this world. Each of these authorities would work together, however, to make decisions for the entire world, which is then what comprises the overall coalition government. The entirety of Moritha and the Klaus's world area all take place within the Radamanthus Authority, and whilst there appears to be continent names stated through the Siren model kit mentioning Africa, there is never any mention and thus any reason to believe that Klaus's world is like our own, featuring these major city names like LA. It is therefore not a contradiction for Earth of Xenoblade X to then use names for their own cities, as it's likely that they never existed in their old world in the first place. Additionally, the mention of a second Project Exodus might also throw people off into believing that this whole theory is a load of nonsense, but I believe that the mention of Project Exodus in Future Redeemed is merely meant as a reference, to point us in the direction of where the series is heading. The reason for that once again lies in the Japanese version, as in the localization of the game, the Earth-Life Colonization Project, Project Exodus, has been specifically translated to mirror Xenoblade X. In Japanese, there is no mention of Project Exodus, which is also true for Xenoblade X, and yes, the idea of Lynn saying Earth-Life Colonization Project, Earth-Life Colonization is a bit weird, but they're the Japanese, so let them off the hook. In Xenoblade X, the change in localization makes sense, but in Future Redeemed, this is wholly unnecessary, and was thus done intentionally to mirror the only good Wii U game ever made. Now perhaps for the English version, this just happened to be the case through pure chance, but when each and every language just so happens to be translated the exact same way, it most certainly isn't, which was confirmed via my buddy Lugal Banda, who's a well-renowned translator, and runs the Xenomira website, link in the description. The point is that there was definitely an extensive effort made to reference Project Exodus via the localization team, when admittedly wasn't necessary at all, which at least tells me that Monolith Soft still hasn't forgotten about Xenoblade X at least. Lastly, there is one final contradiction that I need to resolve. Some of you may be aware that the Samarians were stated by Luxar to have entered this world from another plane, which of of course would go against the idea in theory that they're the people from Klaus's world. Fortunately, however, the wording given here is so vague that it should prove relatively easy to make this work, and I have an idea on how to do that. The word plane suggests something along the lines of a plane of existence or plane of reality, both of which exist within Gnosticism. By utilizing this concept and the potential effects of the Klaus experiment, we may be able to get the desired effect we're looking for. Something to keep in mind though is that we're still unaware of how widespread the effects of the experiment would reach, but if we take Alvis's wording literally, in this moment Klaus destroyed his entire universe and created a new one, technically making this the beginning of the cosmos. If we then assume that the Samarians powered their ships in some capacity via the conduit, either through the technology of slave generators or the human equivalent of an emulator, we can then deduce that these ships may have been protected from the experiment's effects, and therefore allow them to remain within this same reality. This does make some assumptions though, such as the Samarians actually having the technological capacity to harness the conduit's power without something like the Trinity processor nearby. So in the end, it may just be easier to change the meaning of this scene or retcon it altogether into something along the lines of, at the birth of the universe, the Samarians arrived from another world. This is the only retcon I would even consider making for Xenoblade X, due to the original wording and meaning being left so open, whilst this new description still preserves that original meaning. I believe this would be the best way to keep the Xenoblade X story intact, whilst connecting it to Blade in the process, making X the future of the saga, which fits quite nicely when you consider the themes of Xenoblade 3 about looking towards the future. Sadly, however, there are some people on the internet who wish to deny this vision of Takahashi, and they go by the name of Saga fans. Nah, I'm joking, but on a serious note, I don't think Saga can really work due to a number of contradictions between both series, which leads us on to the reasons that I don't believe that Xenosaga can be canon. Firstly, the location of the Zohar on the conduit during the events of both games contradicts one another and breaks either story. If the immigrant fleet didn't take the Zohar off of Lost Jerusalem with them, then the entirety of Xenosaga wouldn't have happened, and if the conduit was removed, then there would be nothing to explain the events surrounding Xenoblade 2. Either way, an entire game story gets erased. People have presented the argument that the conduit could in fact be a Zohar emulator, but sadly this is impossible due to the reality that the emulators were manufactured by Joachim years later, and without these events Momo would never exist. An entire party member would be erased. Additionally, a scientist by the name of Grimoire Verum would need to be completely deleted. Verum was the scientist responsible for causing a matter shift event on Lost Jerusalem after performing an experiment on his daughter, utilizing the Zohar's power, leading to the inhabitants fleeing the planet and Wilhelm sealing it away to prevent the devastation from spreading. This is the Xenosaga equivalent of the Klaus experiment, and realistically, only one of these events can actually occur within the canonical timeline, which is why Klaus would need to replace him along with Dr. T. Masuda. Doing so makes the whole Xenosaga timeline messy, however, as after losing his daughter and going insane, Verum within the UMN performs acts of terrorism through the use of the Gnosis, before eventually meeting his end. This would suggest that instead of rebuilding Ulrest, like Xenoblade 2 would suppose, Klaus instead attacked these residents to revive his non-existent daughter, who apparently could be replaced by Galea, according to some theories. When you get down to the nitty-gritty though, these two simply couldn't be the same person, as their stories are vastly different from one another, and yet they both initiate cataclysms that set their game stories in motion. Likewise, Takahashi would also need to jump over the hurdle that is somehow writing the Gnosis and Fog Beasts around one another. There are a number of similarities surrounding both of these creatures, such as them being the souls of the deceased who are entering from another domain, both requiring the Hilbert effect to make physical contact, contact within our world, and both being able to convert other life forms into themselves. That said, the Gnosis are comprised entirely of salt and are able to turn living beings into salt when they touch them, whereas the fog beasts are composed of, well, fog, and cannot destroy living matter the same way a Gnosis can. The final nail in the coffin, however, is their origin, with Gnosis being the result of those who reject the collective unconscious, whereas the fog beasts are born from the black fog, the friction between both worlds. Furthermore, before the release of Future Redeemed, Takahashi could have easily written the Fog Beasts in a way where they simply turned out to be the Gnosis, especially if he intended to link the series to Xenosaga through the radio scene. But due to his decision not to take that route, I'm left with no other choice but to believe that the two are being left separate from one another. Additionally, even though the Fog Beasts and the Gnosis can't be the same creatures, there is nothing preventing the Tainted from becoming the future of the Fog Beasts, which is another win for Team X. In the end, I find that there are just too many major issues with making Xenosaga canon, and so I ultimately end up siding with Xenoblade X. But what if there was a third option? It would be remiss of me not to mention the possibility of a Xenosaga/Xenoblade X reboot, which could incorporate the best parts from either series. This personally isn't my first choice, as I'm not a fan of ignoring and throwing away all of the work Takahashi has previously put in, but this may at the end of the day prove to be the best outcome. One of the advantages of doing it this way is that we can utilize whatever parts of the story we like and tweak all of it to make it coherent and improve upon the original ideas. Xenoblade X and Xenosaga are actually very similar games in terms of their setting, both being sci-fi and both having the human race lose their original homeworld, which are going to be key parts that we'll need to carry over if we want to stay loyal to the source material. Furthermore, whilst it wasn't the primary theme of either series, both of the aspects and tools necessary to create an interesting trilogy surrounding the theme of the weight of life and how it should all be treated equally, something I attempted to set up for in my theory. Utilizing a combination of the alien races from Xenoblade X and the Realians from Xenosaga, we open up the avenue of creating an amazing antagonist, which could be the entirety of an intergalactic federation, using these slave races to fuel their empire. Meanwhile, the protagonist could employ aspects of both game stories, either originating on Earth before it was destroyed or being stranded in space long after, either of which would work. To then lightly tie this back into the Klaus saga, we can incorporate some aspects from either game, likely something along the lines of the Ghost, who could end up being the equivalent of the crew of the Elsa. The Ghost ship from X already resembles Origin, so tweak this to actually be Origin itself, modified into a spaceship and piloted by the descendants of Ionios, and we have our entire party to face off against this evil federation. To make this more interesting, however, I feel this should actually end up being a three-way fight between this intergalactic federation, our heroes amongst Origin, and Dmitry Yuriev. I feel something like this could create an interesting dynamic in the story, where you have one side which is an evil tyrannical empire who already rules this part of the cosmos and wishes to enslave it all, a second party who wishes to free the slaves but only so that he can recreate the world in his image whilst he sits on top of it all, allowing death and devastation to befall all others, and our party of misfits who wish to free these slaves to create a truly equal society throughout the universe. This creates a war on all sides of the equation, which can shake the very stars themselves and determine the very fate of the future itself. In addition, whilst we no longer need to redeem Klaus himself, this plotline begins the process of the redemption arc for Klaus's world itself, as ultimately it would still be their misdeeds and mistakes which set this story in motion. As is fairly obvious though, already we've managed to create a new plotline for the Xenoblade series to follow, which I believe could actually turn into a really interesting story. Xenoblade X and Xenosaga both have their flaws, but being given a second chance at life like this might overall improve the original works in the first place by being able to appreciate the references and connections that Monolith Soft can integrate into its story. In addition, a story like this is exactly what the Xenoblade series needs, as a break from the fantasy-esque settings for something more dark and realistic would finally allow Takahashi to write the story he's always wanted to tell. Of course, a bare-bones theory like this will have a hell of a lot of holes in it, but this is just an example to display the potential that's there when Takahashi has free reign over all of these different concepts. Before we end this video though, I also want to emphasize that I am absolutely Team Xenosaga Remaster, as it beats trying to emulate the games in the first place. I don't want people to think that I'm anti-Saga, because that simply isn't the case, and I'd love to play a reimagining of the series, but based on all of the knowledge, experience and information I have accumulated over my 10 plus years of intensely following this series, I just see Xenoblade X as being the better route to go down. But that's ultimately my opinion and preference, and each and every person is entitled to their own. With that clarified, I hope you've all found this useful and enjoyed it. If you have, I'd appreciate it if you'd click that subscribe button and notification bell, as Lord only knows how many subs I'm gonna lose after uploading this video. Feel free to share this video around as well if you see someone making a dumb argument about this topic, as hopefully this'll shut them up. I appreciate you all for watching this far into the video though, and hope to catch you in the next one. This is JB, signing off.